Hello and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Tigris podcast, a podcast where I talk to thinkers, experienced professionals, and nomads about Iraq. In this episode, I interview Alissa Walter. Alissa Walter is an associate research professor at the Seattle Pacific University in the United States. Specialized in Middle Eastern studies and the effects of authoritarian regime and dictatorship on its people, she have wrote a book called Contested City. Contested City is a book about Baghdad. It's a book that covers the history of Baghdad and the survival of its people till this day. She talks about how the urban planning have affected the minds of the people and how they interact with each other. She talks about the effects of the Iran-Iraq war and the Gulf War on its people, and also the petitioning system and the rationing system under Saddam's dictatorship, and the negatives and positives of everything. This book showcases the dedication that Alissa Walter has to change the image of Baghdad, a city that is cosmopolitan, that is rich with history, yet so destructed. Reading this book was special to me because it gave me a new filter to view my city, Baghdad, in, and I hope it does that for you too. If you like this episode, I would very much appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, share the episode with your people, and press the like button. I'll leave you now to enjoy the in-depth 2 hour and a half conversation with Alissa Walter. All right. So, what a pleasure it is to be talking to you today, Alissa. I've never imagined this day coming. I know you mentioned this 2 years ago. You said that you were writing this book, and I was pretty excited to hear that an American researcher is writing a book about Iraq, and that was like very interesting to me. And today I'm here, finished the book, reading it, and it is, I can say, an incredible work of art. It helped me personally reshape how I think about Baghdad, and most importantly, I felt like it was honestly a movie throughout my families, like my instant family and my far family, and how they lived, and it made me see things with better understanding, with clarity, and most importantly, with compassion. So I really have gratitude for that, and I really want to thank you for that. Okay, so let's start with the introduction. Now, one thing that really stood out to me in the introduction, I knew that you were mentioning a lot of resources that you did in order to make this book. It helps to note that this is a decade of research, so I was really more over a decade. So I was really surprised about that. But one thing that really stood out to me is the Baath Party archives. Um, as we know, like it has limited access to Iraqi researchers. It has limited access to Iraqis in general, and I just want to ask you, how did it feel like going through the moral dilemma of going through the thousands of lives of Iraqis, their privacy, and what does that really say about Iraqi privacy?
Sarah, first of all, just thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you for reading the book. And I have had, great opportunities getting to share this book, sometimes with different universities or students. But the most meaningful thing to me by far is getting to share this book with Iraqis and getting to hear what Iraqis think about this. And so I just really treasure this opportunity to talk to you today and hear your thoughts. But thank you also for this question. I think it's in some ways one of the most important questions about this research, and not just my research in this book, but kind of all the research that's being done about Iraq and that has been done since the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. Because you're right, the Baath Party archives are in or were taken to the United States and kept there for about 10 years without any meaningful opportunity for Iraqis to go there, except for a very few number who managed to get a visa to the United States, which we know is not easy, had the money to go to Stanford in California, also like the furthest part of the United States from Iraq, just in terms of traveling, right? I mean, so many barriers and limitations. And for those listening who don't know, the Baath Party archives have been sent back to Iraq, finally,
Oh,
thankfully. And
when
yet,
was that? Sorry to
yes,
interrupt.
no, and I'll have to double check the date, but I believe it was in 2021, and I'll have to double check that. But just a few years ago, it was under Prime Minister Al-Qadhimi.
Okay,
Um,
interesting.
and yeah, and so the paper original files were sent back, and also the digital copy that was made in the United States was also sent back. And the issue now is that the government of Iraq has not chosen to make those available. And so the issue of access still remains. It is still true that if Iraqis want to access this, they still have to come to the United States. And so that's the first barrier. And so, what does it mean to work in an archive that is accessible to me only because of war, right? Because why is it in the United States? And that is completely has everything to do with the US invasion in 2003, and even larger than that, a longer history of US attacks on Iraq going back to 1990 and 1991. And so it's awkward, I guess, is like on the most fundamental level. And it's especially awkward when I am speaking to Iraqi academics who I respect very much and who I know would do much better work if they had access to these records, because they have the full cultural context, they have the full, native fluency in the language they have, so that if they were reading the exact same document, for sure, they would extract so much more meaning from it than even I was able to do. And so it's awkward and
Interesting.
it's embarrassing on a certain level, right? To feel the imbalance, to palpably like and the way that it's impacting the production of knowledge about Iraq. So Iraqis always have, are, and continue to produce knowledge about their own history, right? And so I'm on Facebook, and uh, when I get to go to conferences in Iraq, meeting Iraqi scholars who are doing tremendous historical research about Iraq using lots of rich archives and family papers and collections that are here in Iraq, in the country. And yet there's this huge part of Iraq's cultural heritage and political history that isn't accessible. And so on the one hand, it's uncomfortable. On the other hand, I have felt responsibility to help bring the contents of these archives to the public and to Iraqis in the meantime. Like until this situation is fixed, I at least can help bring something about the contents of the archives to light. And this has been controversial. There are researchers who choose not to work in these archives, even like boycott these archives, because they say, well, they shouldn't be in the United States. They shouldn't have been taken out of Iraq. And so they are like immoral. It's immoral to work with them. And I completely understand where they're coming from. Like I have no disagreement with them. And I respect their opinion very much. And I have also felt that if no one does any work in these archives, if we all boycott them, well, then Iraqis will never know what's in there. No one in the world will know what's in there. And I don't know. I don't know if that's the best outcome. And so it's complicated. And I think it's an honest dispute and an honest disagreement where I completely understand why people have taken different positions. But that was the position I took, to say, well, until Iraqis get access, I am here. I have the privilege of my US citizenship and my location in the United States. Let me use this to try to offer something and to keep advocating for better access for Iraqis.
Well, I personally agree with you, to be honest, because I think if we don't, if American scholars or other scholars don't talk about them, then how are we going to know? But I'm curious to know how much of the archive, because I also read in your introduction that there was a lot of resources that you used, which was interviewing people, going through past work of scholars. So, like, how much of this book was made or have been took from the archives?
Great. Yeah, great question. So my book has 6 chapters, and those chapters go chronologically. So the first chapter is about housing, and in that chapter, I look at the 1950s through 1979. Um, and the Baath Party archives should, in theory, include everything from 1968 when the Baath Party came to power in a lasting way. But for some reason, and scholars don't have a good idea why, most of the Baath Party records that we have are mostly from the 90s until 2003. There are also some from the 80s, but there's almost no records from 1968 and into the 1970s. So we don't know if the Baath Party in their headquarters, if they just got rid of old documents, like just they get
Yeah.
old and so they throw them away, or if they were somehow lost for some other reason, we don't know. But so for the chapters of my book that deal with sort of the early period of 50 to 79, I couldn't use the Baath Party archives for that because they just
Okay.
don't talk about those years. So for that chapter, I used um, the archives of a Greek urban planner named Konstantinos Doxiadis, and he did a lot of like urban,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
really
So interested
fascinating work.
to get into that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, British and French and other sources. But so the chapters of my book that deal with the 80s until 2003, and that's chapters 2 through 5, those are really based in the Baath Party archives. And then the final chapter deals with things after 2003. So, of course, in that case, I also had to use other sources. And in that case, it was mostly interviews.
All right. That sounds amazing, and I'm really excited to get into the chapters. So, the first chapter, which was like the most eye-opening for me, to be honest, because I can never go in Baghdad right now and see it differently, because and see it the same. I mean, because it shaped how I look to things. And yes, I am entrenched in the culture and everything, but looking at the history of it and your research about it just changes something, so in the first chapter, I remember that it went from Baghdad or Iraq in general have went from a agriculture based economy into an oil based economy, and that's where the British, when they ruled, and the Hashemite Empire, right? They decided to spend money because they were gaining more money from oil into housing, into urban planning. And that's where Constantine Dioxiadis came in with his plans to how to like construct Baghdad and everything. And it's also very interesting to note that he was chosen because he was Greek, and there was like an onset of World War, so they didn't want to like associate themselves with any country. So that's very interesting to note. How do you think that Constantine Dioxiadis shaped the urban planning of Baghdad, even though his plans wasn't constructed in his day? How do you think it changed Baghdad today?
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Wonderful question. So there have been a lot of scholars who have studied his plans because they are fascinating, and he had a very particular philosophy about how he thought people of different social classes should live together, what the relationship should be between people and car traffic, what should be pedestrian, what should be for cars, and where should there be green space. So for people who are interested in theories of urban planning, it's really rich. And so people have really looked at that. But you're right, actually a lot of his plans didn't actually get implemented. And for me, then I was less interested than in his theories and more interested in like, so what, like what actually manifested for Baghdad. And I think I, there are urban historians who are going to be much more knowledgeable about some of this. So I'm also trying to be humble and like speak to what I can, knowing that, again, people love to research him. So there's a lot out there. But to me, the biggest impact that he had on the development of Baghdad was in his plans for what eventually became Medinat al-Thawra, or Revolution City, now Sadr City. And so, even though I make this point in the book that he actually wasn't the one to construct it, there is very strong indication that his plans for building that eastern part of the city on a grid was very influential in the actual shape and design of that part of the city. And when you look at a map of Baghdad, it's so striking because it's only Sadr City and like Jamila, right, who are on these grids, and no other part of the city is on a grid. So it really sticks out. And the other big part of the city that he has his impact on is actually on the Army Canal because he helped plan and design it. He wanted it to be more of a lush green space. Like he really envisioned really nice gardens on both sides. And there is some of that today. But it had a very practical purpose for helping to control flooding in the city, which is very useful and important. But whenever you have a straight line in a city, it very quickly will have social and psychological significance, right? And so in the US, we have an expression to say, oh, someone was born on the wrong side of the tracks. And we mean the other side of the railroad tracks, because anytime you had a line, always one side would be a good and more desirable part, and another side would be sort of the bad part, the less desirable part. And the exact same thing
Got it.
happens with the
Yeah.
Army Canal, right? That you have sort of the good part of the city, the desirable part, which is the central part of Baghdad, and then the forced relocation of rural migrants on the east side of the canal on this grid. So his vision for that, his plans for that, which were commissioned by the Hashemites as a what they called slum clearance, absolutely has an impact. And then, the other thing I found is that he also had an early role in the idea that people of certain professions could live together or like should live together, or he helped design what that would look like. And so one of the plans that did actually get constructed was called Iskan, and it's a neighborhood in the western part of Baghdad, and it was built for pharmacists, right? So it was like, oh, in this neighborhood, this profession is going to live there. And it was for practical purposes, not like philosophical purposes or ideological. It was just, oh, we want to help attract these educated Iraqis to come to the capital, to work in the government, to help bring all the talent right to the center of the country. And then they started distributing land and housing to these professional organizations. And so all the pharmacists got houses here. But as I point out, then every government after them kind of kept the same pattern going. And so Baghdad is so fascinating in the way that it had, Hail Dhubat, and it had, Hail Jamia, and it has Hail Mukhabarat, and like all, all of these
Yeah.
professional neighborhoods that really shaped the character of the city. And I think especially in the 60s and 70s. I know today many of the original owners don't live there anymore. But there was a time when literally every single one of your neighbors would have the same job, which is just
Yeah.
so like, what impact does that have on the society?
That's like very intertwined. One thing that I really want to go through is that when I saw the map figure of the bus road in your book,
Mm.
it didn't include the Sadr city, or what is known back then Thawra city. It didn't even include it in the map. So what does that say?
Yeah, I think there was A lot of people who were either in the government or hired by the government to be urban planners or do urban policy or in the municipality, a lot of different people at that time in the professional classes only considered certain Iraqis to count, like to really be seen and acknowledged as real citizens of the country and real members of the community and residents of the city. And so people who lived in the informal huts, right, the sarayef, it was like this class of leaders and bureaucrats like literally couldn't see them, like didn't want to see them. There was almost this intentional blindness towards them. Now, uh, some Iraqis who were doing surveys and um, like social research in Baghdad from the 50s through the 70s, they were actually making arguments that maybe 50% of the residents of Baghdad at that time lived in Sorayef. Like that's how many people, like it could have been 100,000 people in the city at that time were living in what we call informal housing, like housing that's not durable.
Yeah.
But they don't appear on the maps. They aren't receiving social services. They aren't receiving infrastructure benefits. And so even, it's, Abdul Karim Qasim and then later the Baath Party in 1963 that start to actually build Medina Tawra on the east, right? So that's in the late 50s, early 60s. By the time you get to the 1980s, there are parts of what was then actually called Saddam City, right? There were places where the roads were still not paved, where they still had no uh, water pipes, right? Where they just there was not this investment in infrastructure to actually say, no, this community is also part of the city, right? Like this, everyone belongs. We all have like an equal right to the city.
Yeah.
And so this sort of neglect lasts in many different periods of Baghdad's history and many different governments.
Yeah, and as you talk about the different areas of Baghdad and their professions, it lasted for a very, very long time, until this day, because it never really goes away. Still identities, the social identity. You know this, and you have already mentioned it in your book, is that we really depend on where the person is from to judge who they are as a person. So it never really goes away, and it needs like a lot of decades of change. And also, I'm interested to know what kind of effect that you think that these people that were intentionally segregated from the city, what kind of effect that had on their lives.
Yeah. So in the early years, so most of the people who were forcibly settled into what was then Medina Tawra were mostly from the south, right? Were mostly from agricultural backgrounds. Um, Many of them had a stronger sense of like the tribe and their tribal identity being important to them, where there were some urban residents of Baghdad who also identified with tribes, but maybe less so. And of course, many of them are Shia, right? Because that was part of the majority community in the regions where they were coming from. And so they had sort of distinctive um, social characteristics that in some ways matched, right? Like there are other parts in Baghdad where, of course, people are Shia. There's other parts of Baghdad where people had moved from rural backgrounds, maybe a generation before. So it's not like they don't share any characteristics, but because they are segregated in this one area, they get viewed as distinct, right? And they develop socially, there's a lot of stereotypes and I think negative associations that other people in Baghdad develop about them, especially upper classes. So the community that ended up being, forcibly settled or resettled into the area of Medina Tawra, they were cut off from the rest of the city symbolically, right? To be on the other side of the canal, to be on the eastern side of the city, to be where there are few buses that come to them, right? Like just feeling separated, and all of the other residents of Baghdad can see how this community is being separated. And so these structures, I think, very naturally start to contribute to people's ideas of difference. Like, this part of Baghdad is this way, but that part of Baghdad is different, and the people that live there are different. And I think what that contributed to was a like perpetuating an uneasy relationship between this eastern district and the rest of the city, and it changes over time. And so, you know, in the 50s and 60s, it was all about, well, these are really rural people, and they're bringing their buffaloes, and they are, you know, building these sarayef, and they don't live like the urban residents. By the time you get to, say, the 70s or 80s, it's, oh, well, they're communists. Oh, that's where the Dawa party is hiding. Oh, that's where, you know, in the Iran-Iraq war, right? That, oh, this is maybe where people who have affiliations with Iran are living, or this is where, then in the 90s, it's this is where criminals live, right? And so the
Yeah.
exact stereotypes vary with the context, but the relationship is uneasy. And from what I see, I think remains uneasy to this day, but it's lots of things all at once. It's class difference, but it's also a history of difference. It's like the experience that people had in Sadr City, they did have different experiences with the government, did have different social and cultural experiences. They were perceived as the other. And so to this day, I do think some of those distinctions remain. And I know that Baghdadis talk about those distinctions as well.
Yeah.
But I'm curious what you
Um,
think, right? Like, you know, these neighborhoods
Definitely.
and their perceptions.
So the thing is, there's always a general stereotypes about this people, but like obviously from your book and reading the history of them, um, they kind of have like a certain cultural narrative among Baghdadis, which is perceived as like dangerous, troublesome, with like very tribal beliefs, or how can I say it? It's like beliefs that are very entrenched in a person. But the thing is, I saw in the book that this effect, as you said, lasted for a lot of like governments, till Saddam, till this day. So, one of the things that really took place in segregating Baghdad neighborhoods, other than the Sarifa dwellers, which is known now as Sadr City and others, is the neighborhoods of professions. So, one thing that I remember in the book is that you mentioned that the the government deliberately took people who were middle class, who were doctors, lawyers, engineers, closer to the grounds of power, let's say Khadra, right, known as Khadra today, in order not to, let's say, not to control them, but to win their trust. So they provided them with housing, they provided them with benefits of mortgages, so they could influence them, because they know this part of people, they can be bought with their mindset can be bought with a little bit of money for the benefit of the political power. So what are your comments on that?
Yeah, so I think there's a combination of things, and I think some of it definitely has to do with power. I think probably some of it was just very practical, you know, just if you're thinking about, you know, Baghdad under the British suddenly is a capital city once again, right? Of course, Baghdad has been a capital like under the Abbasids, and but now after the Ottomans, it's a capital of a new country, but it's a really small town, right? I think there's 100,000 people that live in Baghdad around the time of the British in World War One. And so if you're trying to run a you know, this a capital and really modernize it for the 20th century, they just actually need more people. And so there is partly um, the government is also thinking kind of opportunistically about the future, and Baghdad, because it's built on a wide open area, there is actually lots of land. So some cities are built near
Yeah.
water or near mountains, right? So they're more constricted. They have land. So they're like, let's just give it away. And then the interesting thing, right, is that once Baghdadis in the middle classes get used to the idea that residential land should be a standard benefit for government workers, you can't easily get rid of that. And right, because then people will complain a lot. So we see
Yeah.
like even now it's very common for people to have this benefit of residential land that they received from the government at some point, in their family's
Yeah.
history.
Yeah, but I remember that Dioxyadis had this concern of people being dependent on the government, so that they made it like little they lowered the prices to get the houses, not give them for free. So yeah.
Yeah, right. They were very careful. They didn't want people to like, we just expect handouts, right? So they didn't want to
Yeah.
corrupt people and make them not work hard. But so oftentimes what it was then is like land was given, but then you had to build on it, but with discounts, right? Like with benefits.
Yeah,
So
true. Exactly. All right. So, let's go to chapter 2, which is my second favorite. And it starts with the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, at the beginning, I was surprised, and this is something that I asked my mom about, is that there was not public knowledge of the war. Like Baghdadis didn't even know they were going through war, and that was because of the messages that was Saddam was like portraying to the public, that everything is good and we're constructing and we want to go through this summit. I think it's a non-aligned something summit. So he's like
yeah,
building to that, and it was his dream, and everything seemed okay for the modern. I mean, the local Baghdadi, right? But then, even when the war started, it was named Qadisiyat Saddam. And it's from the name Qadisiyah battle, which is the first battle Muslims won on the Persians. And so this like ego-centric propaganda, I feel like it never really goes away, you know? It really affects a person deeply. What do you think about that?
yeah, right. So I think so Saddam had been part of the inner circle of, in the government since 1968, but it's not until, right, 1979, 1980 that he becomes president in his own name. And so the war is really important to him. It's really important for him to solidify his power, like we call it the cult of personality, right? Like, even though, right, he was clearly, people had known him and even feared him for his power before becoming president outright. But now he needs to make, make sure no one is going to challenge him. And the war presents an excellent opportunity. And I know it's terrible to think about a war in which so many people die as this opportunity, but unfortunately, it seems that this is how he, in fact, was approaching it, right? That this is an opportunity for him to spread his propaganda, to name things after himself, to build himself these monuments, and to force people in a way to have to follow him and his orders more and more closely, because now it's an emergency. Right now, the country, especially once Iran gains the momentum in the war, and then now it's a threat, and now the country's under attack, and now everyone needs to rally around the leader. And it's it's something like a classic move in history. Like lots of rulers, even back to like, the Romans, use war to become more powerful. But Saddam does this very deliberately and very intentionally. But to me, one of the most interesting things was to think about how different parts of Iraq experienced this war. There's a wonderful scholar named Dina Hori, and she wrote a wonderful, incredible book about Iraq in wartime, all about that experience. And she also uses the Baath Party archives, actually. But like
Yeah, I
naturally, a
remember.
lot of her,
Yeah. I
yeah,
remember in the
and
book,
not,
yeah.
yeah, I know I have to talk about her a lot, especially in this chapter because she has done such good work. but like naturally she talks a lot about Basra because Basra is on the front lines. Basra is like devastated during this war. Most of the casualties in Iraq are people that live near and around Basra. Baghdad, like you said, is initially very protected from the war. And then over time, they have to get pulled in because this war is so all encompassing. It goes on for so much longer than Saddam initially thought. But yeah, he's like, let's build a new airport. Let's host a convention. And then it's interesting even that it's during the war that he builds the victory arches, that he builds
Which
the
is, yeah.
martyrs monument, these Baghdad monuments, right? Not in Basra. He's building them in the capital because really they're more about him and the story he wants to tell,
Yeah,
right?
so it's out of vanity. Yeah, definitely. Saddam like didn't just do that. Like he controlled the memory of the public, and I believe he did that through holidays, which is something that is crazy to hear, to be honest. But do you mind explaining more about that?
Yeah, right. So during the Iran-Iraq War, and again in these early years of Saddam's presidency, he needed to keep people's morale high, keep them excited about the war, keep them supporting him. And so there were just always new opportunities to have new parades, new holidays, new and so one of the things I mentioned is basically the entire month of July becomes like a government holiday because you have the anniversary of the 1968 um, Baath Party Revolution. So that's a big thing. Later, Saddam's birthday in April becomes a national holiday. And actually, I've met Iraqis who, a friend of mine, her son happened to be born on Saddam's birthday. And so their family
They
then
get benefits.
received yeah, like they received lots of gifts because it was like, oh, your son shares the honor of sharing the president's
Oh my
birthday, right?
God. It's very
Yeah.
egocentric.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then, yeah, like, and anytime, new troops were sent to the front, there'd be that, then there's Martyrs Day, then right? So there's all these new war associated holidays. Um, and they become opportunities for school children to recite poetry, to Saddam, for people, it becomes opportunities to help do donation drives. So women being pressured to donate their gold jewelry, which, is puts them in great like financial like vulnerability, especially when their husbands are at the war. Donate, push people to donate blood, push people to join the popular army, right? So this was another thing I looked at in the book. There's the normal army, but then there's the
Yeah.
popular army. And that way they could recruit teenagers, they could recruit elderly men, they could recruit more women. And so just trying to pull everyone into the war apparatus. And so there are these crazy statistics like the population of Iraq in the 80s, if I remember correctly, is 13 million. Iraq's army had a standing army of 1 million. And
Well,
during the course of the war, 3 million people served. So it's like
basically
any
all.
adult male. Yes, it's
Yeah.
like a full
And
quarter of the population.
that's where the fertility campaign comes in. It's that you girls need to produce more people. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Well, the story of feminism in Iraq is very closely connected to the Iran-Iraq War. And this is something, again, where I am so appreciative of some of my other colleagues who have done really great work studying the history of feminism in Iraq, because the war shifts the messaging. So the beginning of the war, all the men are off fighting. So you need women to come work. And the Baath Party in the 60s and 70s had already been promoting women to work. So that was just more of the same, but just even further encouraged. So they had these amazing things that, to be honest, we have never had in America, like, free childcare and free like paid
Yeah.
maternity leave for like all this time to help women join the workforce. But
Yeah.
at the end of the war, that everything changes because now they need men to come back and men to work. And that's when you see the General Federation of Iraqi Women, which is the Ba'ath Party feminist organization, starting to change what their messaging is, and the government changing policies and saying, no, women, now your patriotic duty is to stay home and have babies. But it's short-lived because sanctions come so soon after. And so the government's like, oh, we can't keep telling people to have babies if they can't even feed
For
their
them.
families. So it's short-lived, but you can see the change in the government's priorities. I should say that there were many women in the General Federation of Iraqi Women who were trying to push back. I mean, I don't want to say, and actually part of my book is pointing out that it's not like Saddam says one thing and everyone just says, yes, sir, yes, okay. People are trying to push back
Yeah.
in their own ways, and people are being creative, but the government's shifting in priorities, and therefore some of what is being repeated in newspapers and magazines and speeches about women and women's roles is changing by the late 80s.
So, perhaps this is something to talk about more in the upcoming chapters. But since while we're on the topic, the aspect of being a decent woman in Baghdad, and this is something that I lived and I still see to this day, is that being a decent woman is a woman who stays at home, fulfill her home duties. It's not shown in the public. And that's perhaps we'll go through in chapter 5, I believe, where prostitution and sexual behavior was in popular in the city. It's my question is like, do you think, being a researcher and having this immense experience with Iraq, do you think that the role of women today, in this day, that is like of a decent woman that stays home, is actually shaped by the regime, Saddam's regime, or it's something tribal that came
Mm.
way back from history?
Yeah, good questions, big questions, right? So as a historian, I would feel more comfortable pointing to lots of factors working in combination. So I think, I mean, there's these really famous photographs of women in Baghdad in the 60s and 70s wearing mini skirts, right? Like at the University of Baghdad, wearing short skirts, not covering their hair, studying anything they want to, medicine, becoming doctors, and then even again, like in the war, working these jobs. And it's true, right? That is undeniably historical fact that like there were these opportunities for women in the public to take on these kinds of roles. But I would also want to say that if you only look at that photograph, like you're only seeing one piece of society, because gender norms are always impacted by like urban or rural, what social economic class, like rich or poor, like what kind of jobs are available to you. Even like a woman, so low income women have often worked because they're working in the markets or they're working in the fields, they're working, right? But if you're working in a market and you're interacting with lots of people all the time, you might not feel comfortable wearing a short skirt, right? Like that just might not be a place where you so women can be working in public, but depending on their social class, that might require different lifestyles of them or different ways of engaging with the public, different ways of dressing and presenting themselves. So it's always going to be like context dependent and social class dependent, all these things. But when I'm talking about national trends, like we were just mentioning, the 90s brings in all sorts of new influences that I do think have this really clear impact on the way that women of all backgrounds feel that they can now move in public. But I think there's a few things that happen at once. So sanctions happens, and with sanctions, people have less money for their clothing, people have less money for beauty care and things like that. And so some women feel, if I wear abaya, I actually don't need to buy as many clothes, right? Or maybe I can just keep my abaya in good shape and you won't see that some of my clothes underneath are just getting older because I can't buy new ones. So there's like a some and some for some people that might have been a piece influencing some of their change to more conservative dress. You also have, right, the women being pushed out of the workforce, being pushed by the government, but also pushed by returning men, or not even pushed, but just, if in a lot of families, if the woman, maybe it's an older sister, maybe it's the mom or wife, had been working and then her husband comes home from the war, but he's not working, there might be just sort of an internal family kind of discussion of like, well, the mom's going to stay home now, and now the husband's going to go to war. And maybe she didn't feel pushed. It just felt like the way they want to handle it. But when women are now staying home more, they also have less like need to go out. And so you just start seeing fewer women out and about, and then that starts to change what people's sense of normal is. And if women aren't working, they might also not be buying like outside clothes. I like to think of it, like they might just be wearing more like house clothes more often, right? And then just,
Yeah.
oh, I'll just throw on an abaya when I'm going to the market. But then there's a few other things that happen. So there's the faith campaign. So Hamlet al-Iman is something that Saddam Hussein implements. A lot of people look at that and say, that's where intentionally some more conservative cultural trends got supported and amplified, including impacts from tribal culture, but also
What
religious
is
culture. Like it's not.
yeah, oh,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
sorry to interrupt. What is the faith campaign?
So this is something my colleague Samuel Helfont has written a whole book about. He also used the Baath Party archives. And so in some ways I've sort of been like, that's his project, and I'll focus on some other things. But so as part of the faith campaign, Saddam Hussein's government wanted to show that he was pious and that his government was pious. Now, this is a huge change. Those who were watching Saddam Hussein in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, he wasn't praying in public a lot. He wasn't, a lot of the city didn't close restaurants during Ramadan. Like there was more outward secularism, even if lots of people were still themselves quite devout in their faith. But Saddam decided that it was to his advantage to appear more pious. And this actually began in the 80s because he has a country that is majority Arab Shiites. Like that's the largest demographic in the country. And you have the Ayatollah Khomeini saying, Iran is the true Shiite government, and Saddam is an atheist. And like, how can true Shiites follow him? He's so secular. So Saddam began to visit Karbala and Najaf. Saddam began to pray in public. So he's already beginning to try to counteract Iranian propaganda. But then in the 90s with sanctions, he's trying to shore up the country, keep them unified, keep them content with him. And during times of hardship, many people find comfort in religion, understandably. Like this is, I mean, true for me as well. And so promoting faith is important, but he's very intentional about only supporting preachers who will support him, right? So it's very politicized, of course, right? But he builds a religious studies seminary. Like he has this institute. He starts having international conferences with religious leaders. But so some people point to this and say, well, more women start wearing hijab in the 90s. And is it because of the faith campaign? Is it because people are scared and suffering and turning towards their faith? Is it because Saddam is now signaling that it's okay to be religiously, like outwardly showing your religious expression, that's safe to do now? The government will look at you suspiciously. There's sort of poverty, like there's lots of factors, but the sum total of them is changing the way that women and girls are living. Oh, sorry. The other huge factor is crime. Huge. Crime skyrockets in the 90s because of people's economic hardship and because the government is also less able to provide security during this time. Like it's just a weakened government, but really it's the poverty that is driving this. And so I have heard from so many families and so many individuals who grew up during that time just saying it no longer felt safe. And so girls stayed home out of safety. And if they did go out, they covered up much more to try to protect themselves. And it didn't help that the president's son, Uday, was a known criminal. I mean, like, was
Wow.
known to
Yeah.
abduct women, harass women. And so there was
Yeah.
just a lot of fear about protecting women.
All right, so I think it's time to go to chapter three, which is the rations chapter. A lot of people think that this era was the best era of Saddam. I mean, nothing was functioning, but the rations were functioning, right? But in your book, you mentioned the actual intentions of control from the Baath Party through the rations. Now, in the Soviet Union, there were rations, and there were really to provide for the people. How did Saddam use them as a method of control?
Yeah. So the 90s were a period of like desperate survival for everyone, right? So for the Iraqi people, they are facing unemployment, they are facing potential hunger or even starvation. They are facing, all of their life savings becoming worthless because the currency, right? So like desperate survival. And the government is also in this position of like facing kind of desperate circumstances as well. Not to be sympathetic to them, but just to understand like where they're coming from. So, the sanctions are ruining the Iraqi economy, which threatens, the whole point of the sanctions actually really is to weaken and eventually end Saddam Hussein's regime. That's like the whole point. That's why the UN, with the strong support of the US, is pushing this policy. So the government knows like its existence is under threat. It no longer has a lot of resources. There was the uprising in 1991, the Intifada, where like almost the entire country is rising up in anger against the government. People who were Baath Party members are being attacked. So like the whole ruling apparatus, like they don't like they're under threat. And then the Baghdad was horribly bombed in 91. And the US continues to bomb Iraq periodically, right? For example, in 1998. So the government introduces food rationing very, very early on, right? So the sanctions policy is announced in August of 1990. By October 1990, the government is already doing emergency food distribution. And by January 1991, it is like a well worked out system. So the government is doing this for a few reasons. Like, on the one hand, if the Iraqi people are actually literally starving, there will be riots. And so in the government's own self-interest, they need to feed the people so that people don't continue to rise up against them, which like they did, right? Like they had, right? So like that's a very real threat. So they are providing it. That's also a form, though, of control, right? It's helping ensure their political survival by helping to ensure kind of bare minimum food is reaching everyone for Iraqi survival. But then, right, as the government is providing this food, Iraqis of all backgrounds are using it, right? So the poorest Iraqis, this is all they're eating. But even for middle class Iraqis and even upper class Iraqis, people are not going to turn away free food, right? They're using it. Sometimes they sell it to get other things they need. Sometimes they eat it, but then they have a little money to supplement it with maybe fresh fruit or vegetables or something. But everyone is using it. And so that gives the government a lot of power and a lot of leverage, because then what Saddam does is he threatens to cut off people's rations if they are not obeying. And I mentioned that there are two groups in particular that really get targeted. And the first group are soldiers who desert from the army. And the second group are government employees. And both groups, if you think about it, are like the populations that if the government can control anyone, they should be able to control their soldiers and their employees. And so it's crucial for Saddam to actually run a country, right? He needs actual bureaucrats to show up to work. He needs his soldiers to be like ready to defend the country, but he also needs to be able to show that he's still in control. And it looks really bad if you can't get teachers to show up to school. But of course, that is a massive problem because people's paychecks are worth nothing. So there's something like 12,000 teachers who stopped going to school. And as a result, like literacy rates really suffer in Iraq too. So anyway, so the government is using food both to help ensure its survival and try to help make the population kind of able to survive, but also kind of happier with the regime, but then threatening to cut it off to keep people in line.
Yeah. So, in the Soviet Union, when punishments were there, it was really because of the economic impact of people not going and working in factories, and the economic impact of not having workers. But in Saddam's era, it's all about the image, and from the way I see it, the way I see chapter three, is that it's sectioned into two parts. Which, first of all, this rationing system had empowered local representatives in the Baath Party to use these rations in order to have to control relationships, to control even the money that they get, because at some point I believe that the rations were assigned to someone in the neighborhood, and that someone also got corrupted by selling them in the black markets and all of that. So there's a system side of it, and also there's like the side where people were tortured, really tortured, and some horrible stories were mentioned in your chapter about um, fathers begging to get the rations back, for mothers like disowning their own sons for doing a bad thing, because there's the generational punishment that Saddam had, much like North Korea, right? So it's not just you; it's your family who get punished. But then when there's like a reward, it's only you. So it's not very fair, right? Um, so this two parts, which I feel like it was with the petition part, which we're gonna get into, is like the heaviest things that the Saddam did, and when I think of it, I never like imagined, I never like thought of Saddam's era as this two controlling things. I've heard another story, but like it's very revealing and very eye-opening to me, right? So how do you think that impacted Iraqis?
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right in that when we think about like brutal dictatorships, sometimes we think about the individuals who were targeted and the horrific experiences people had in prisons, right? Like, or political prisoners. But with rations, what happened here was that the government gained control over everyone, right? And you didn't have to be politically active. You didn't have to belong to like an underground opposition group because everyone needs to eat, right? Like, so the government is like, I guess how I would think about it is like in the 60s and 70s, people could try to be like non-political. They're just going to go to work, go to school, keep their head down. They don't have to care as much about politics. In the 80s, with conscription, more and more people have to participate. But by the time you get to food rationing in the 90s, it's 100% of the population is now has to interact with the government, and there's no avoiding it anymore. And
Even the
so it's
migrants. So it was a way
yeah,
for
even
them. Yeah,
foreigners, like yeah, like the
yeah.
Egyptians who are in Iraq, like
It was a way of
everyone has rations, the
controlling,
children.
knowing who was entering and who was like, yeah.
Yeah, so the rations card, just that, like not even the food part, not even the threat, but just having every single person in the country register in their neighborhoods. And then you have to check their address every time they come in to pick up their food rations. It's a huge like intelligence operation, right? And the government now gets to monitor everyone. And you mentioned, yeah, these like neighborhood officials, you get the rations agents who, by the way, are just the grocery store owners, right? Like they are the people who had the small markets, the small shops in a neighborhood. Suddenly the government says, you're going to be the one to distribute rations. So they know the people in the neighborhood already. Because one thing people would try to do is if you on your rations card, maybe you pretend you have 5 children instead of 3, because then you'll get more rations. Or maybe, you know, someone in your family passes away. Maybe you try to keep that a secret so that their name stays on the ration card. It's harder to do that when the people in charge of checking the names and addresses are actually your neighbors. Right. And so the government is like kind of turning as many people into informants as they can. And the food rations just provides all sorts of new opportunities for the government to gain that kind of surveillance capabilities over the people. And then, yeah, because as you mentioned, they used collective punishment. So if your brother was a police officer and stopped showing up to work because his paycheck was worthless, well, it's not just your brother who's now in trouble. It's every single member of the family on your rations card, which could be up to 20 people, right? So maybe your grandma lives with you. Maybe you have like your sister's husband died and she's a widow and now she lives back with your family. I mean, you could have all sorts of people on your rations card, and every single one of them will now face hunger. And so it was absolutely designed to turn family members against each other. Because if you didn't turn in your family member, and you knew where they were and you knew it was happening, well, now the punishment's even worse. And so people were just in terrible situations where there was no good option. And this is the chapter that just broke my heart the most. I mean, just some of these letters and some of the situations that families found themselves in, like you mentioned, the father and his son, you can see how much people love their family and yet are sort of forced into terrible choices of, do you let your whole family suffer, or do you turn over the one that the government wants, or do you all try to escape and leave everything? I mean, like, none of these choices are good, none of these choices are easy, and that's what this policy did to people. And so you're asking, like, well, what did this do to society? A lot of Iraqis have told me that starting in the 90s, people began to trust each other less, and people began to sort of withdraw. Like the relationships with their neighbors became weaker, and because people didn't have money, like if so, you know, hospitality in Iraq is wonderful and famous and, you know, fantastic. If you invite someone to your house, of course you have to offer them tea, you have to offer them sweets, you have to offer them a meal, you have to give them your best food. But people didn't have anything to share, and so it was embarrassing. So people would just stop inviting as many people over, and then you don't trust each other and there's more informants. And so I think the government really tried to weaken social bonds. I don't think the government ever succeeds all the way in this. I mean, like, I think society is resilient, people care about each other, people risk their lives for each other. But the government's trying, and it is having effects.
Especially with a community like Iraq, where I know this is not a question for you to answer maybe, but like, how do you think things change? Because now Iraqis are like, they known for their generosity, but they also not so long ago went through a period where they surveilled on their neighbors. They had to give out their own children to the regime in order to save another family, you know, like, so how do you think that came to this point, you know, where Iraqis are very
I,
generous?
I think, I mean, Iraqis have always told me, Arabs anywhere in the Arab world have always told me, you know, generosity is just instilled from such a young age, that this is this is how you treat each other, and this is what you want, and this is what you expect, and this is like what it means to have good morals and good character, and taking care of the
Yeah,
guest. And I just have to say how much I have experienced that, and just felt so loved through that. But
yeah,
in my experience talking with Iraqis, there is so much pain that's just below the surface, right? Like, And it's pain from so many parts of history, you know? And so I think it's hard. And I imagine, I know, I mean, when I ask Iraqis about their past, there's a lot of pain, but it matters who else is in the room. Like I think Iraqis amongst themselves, it's very delicate because there are people who made survival choices under the Ba'ath Party that people are not proud of, right? Ways in which they may have collaborated with the regime, ways in which they may have acted as an informant for who knows what motives, or because they were forced to, because they were themselves tortured or mistreated, right? And then there's pain that comes from the American invasion. And that's something, you know, that when it comes to the generosity of Iraqis, I have often found that the first 3 or 4 times I meet with someone and have tea and am welcomed, it's all welcome. It's all just positive. And it's not until that we've built a stronger friendship that they will then feel that they can share some stories of pain from their experiences with Americans. But I also know, you know, the sectarian war. I think the pain there to me has often seemed the most fresh, the most raw, the most difficult still. And so that Iraqis have persisted in their hospitality and generosity in spite of all that is a testament to the Iraqi people. I mean, I don't think there's any other people in the world that have suffered so much and still share so openly, and not just with foreigners like myself, but I see this among, and especially among young Iraqis who say, we don't want the pain of past generations to shape our future, and we don't want to still live in a sectarian world. Like we want to heal and move forward. And I think actually that the generosity and hospitality is part of that healing. It's like, no, we will keep treating each other with kindness as we deserve. Anyway, I just have so much respect and admiration.
That's very, very thoughtful and very nice to hear, to be honest. Okay, so I think we have to now go to chapter 4, which is the petition part. The petition part is very, very interesting to me, and I'll mention in a bit why. But you, a lot of the petitions, yes, there were requests of asking for help and needing help, but also many of them was to show their commitment to the regime. But do you mind explaining the term gesture politics and what does
Oh,
that
sure.
really mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So I think these kinds, so in the Ba'ath Party archives, I'll just explain briefly. So these are government, you know, it's the memos and the paperwork of the ruling party. But what was interesting to me is that anything that kind of ordinary citizens sent, well, the bureaucrats in the Ba'ath Party saved it and put it in the archive. And so I was so amazed to find all of these letters that were written by kind of ordinary Baghdadis that were written. A lot of them were written to maybe Tariq Aziz or to Saddam Hussein, or, you know, to someone in the inner circle. But also there were other ones that were written to their local, the Furqa, the local neighborhood Ba'ath Party office, and kind of everyone in between. So just any letter written to anyone in the Ba'ath Party was saved in the archive. And these were such a like a treasure. I mean, like just this amazing insight into like what real people were saying and thinking and how they interacted with the regime. But of course, if you're going to write a letter to someone in Saddam Hussein's dictatorship, you don't just write it casually. Like this is high stakes because the government has instilled so much fear in people and has so much power that you have to be really careful. And so I was actually amazed that people felt sort of brave to write anything. Um, and so a lot of people wrote their letters to be very flattering, you know, and so they would say, you know, Mr. President, the warrior, the leader for our faith, the mujahid, the father of all Iraqis, may, you know, God protect and preserve you, all of which I expected. I mean, you're kind of like, yeah, that's probably the way people would feel safe talking to the regime. But you're right. Like some people would write letters, not even asking for anything, just to sort of show, to perform, to demonstrate their loyalty. And that's the term gesture politics, where this person doesn't explain why they're doing it, but probably there's something going on that's making them feel like maybe they or their family is coming under some doubt or some scrutiny. There's some reason why they feel the need to go above and beyond and name their children after Saddam's children, right? Or to write a poem to Saddam with their own blood. So I interpret this as someone who wants to secure the idea that they and their family are loyal. And why does someone do that? Well, probably because there's some suspicion somewhere, even if they don't explain that.
Yeah, because of fear. That's correct, but you also mentioned the language of citizens. And the reason why this chapter was important to me, yeah, it was like in North Korea, I've heard someone who got out of it say that language is a way to control people, and also in the book 1984 by George Orwell, it's a big way to control how people think. So the concept of freedom instills the ideas of freedom, right? um in this chapter I saw that there are people who wrote petitions in a way that they believed in their rights. So it started with I am the citizen Fatma, I am the citizen Sarah, but there is also a supplicant language of people begging and worshiping Saddam in the beginning of the letter, and then saying that. So how does that balance come, you know?
Yeah, so yeah, as I was mentioning, I'm like it felt expected to me when I saw people act like a supplicant. Yeah, and that's the phrase that I use in the book where they are begging, they are pleading, they are flattering. And I that to me I completely can understand and empathize with because of the absolute power that Saddam had and the fear people had and wanting to feel like they're saying everything right, you know? But then what was fascinating to me was that, so I looked at about 100 letters in detail, all written by people in Baghdad. About a third of them used a very different kind of language that was much bolder, much more straightforward. And as you mentioned, was talking about their rights. And so I was like, oh, people could talk back to the regime sometimes or in certain topics, right? In certain areas. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that people could be forceful. So that was teaching me a lot about also like how smart and strategic Iraqis were. Like they understood exactly where the line was. If you were complaining that your rations agent was actually stealing from you, well, actually, the government did want to get that rations agent in trouble. They actually were interested in going after them. So it was interesting. Like there were these times when Iraqis could really advocate for themselves forcefully and sometimes even get a positive response from the government.
So, can we say the rations, sorry, the petitions were a form of surveillance, not just for who was working in the Baath party and under the Baath party, but like for the people?
Yeah, so it helped to even the power imbalance. And actually, petitions have worked this way a long time. Like even in the Ottoman period, you would have peasants write petitions to the Sultan saying your local governor is corrupt because again, like the Sultan actually wants to know that, like know if people are abusing power under his rule. So they're kind of using an old form of political grievance, but one that Saddam even publicly encouraged. So there were times when he gave speeches and he said publicly, he's like, the purpose of petitions is so that he can keep an eye on low ranking officials. And he actually complained. He has this really funny note in his speech where he says, I don't want to hear from housewives. I don't want to hear from housewives who are just complaining that their bread's expensive. He's like, I'm the president. I don't have time to deal with that. Although actually that's what a lot of people were writing about. They were writing about like very ordinary concerns. So people didn't take his advice. But he said, I don't care about the housewives complaining on the phone and they think the president has nothing else to do but look into this. He's like, what I want to know is if any low ranking officials are being corrupt. That I want to know. And so it was a form of surveillance internally because as much as the government under Saddam is spying on the people, they are making sure to spy internally too. That's why there's so many different militias. That's why there's Baath party representatives everywhere who are being asked to inform on each other. I mean, when you're a dictator, I think you have to be paranoid that someone is going to want to overthrow you, whether that's the people or someone even in your own government. So Saddam was paranoid and had a lot of spies everywhere, but including asking the people to spy on not just their neighbors, but to spy on low-ranking officials.
Interesting. This petition thing is like it's like it's serving all of the purposes that Saddam wanted: a good image of himself, a surveillance way of controlling everyone, but to provide the people the food. And yet there are many Iraqis who think that it was something good, you know? So this like mindset of people being so in the thing that they cannot see above it, they cannot have the bird eye view is for me the most heartbreaking, and also the most interesting, because you see how people behave and act under a dictatorship, but not also just under the dictatorship, years after the dictatorship. So again, maybe I'm asking this question a lot, which is, what do you think is the effect that it had on Iraqis? But I think there's a lot of effects. So I have to ask this question, whether it's like the people depending on the government too much, you know, for everything. And that's something that you also mentioned in chapter 6, where people didn't accommodate to the US councils when they came because they expected the government to get into their personal details and personal needs, you know?
That's right. Yeah. So when I think of these petitions, I think of them as a survival strategy, you know, and so, but maybe just one survival strategy again amongst many. So, for example, like when I'm in the archives, all I can see is what's in the archives, and I can't see the whole picture. I can just see the papers in front of me. And so I could see a letter in which a mother whose husband has died, and this woman is providing for her children, and she writes a letter and she says, "Dear President, may God protect and preserve you. My children need medicine, or my children need food." Now, this woman she may not actually like Saddam. She may not support him. She probably isn't a Ba'ath Party member, or she would have other ways of getting support. So probably she's just independent politically. And she's writing to try. Just who knows? Who knows if she'll get a response? Who knows if anything will come of this? But it's cheap to do. It's just a letter. But maybe you'll get a big benefit, right? It's almost like a lottery ticket. Like, who knows? I'll throw this out there, but maybe I'll get food, or maybe I'll get medicine. But it could be that at the exact same time as she's writing this letter, maybe she also has a brother who escaped to Europe and is sending her money. Maybe she's also selling things on the black market. Maybe she's also, heaven forbid, but maybe, right, she's also engaging in sex work it's like there might be many strategies she's doing at the same time, but I can't see that just from her letter. But I can imagine probably people didn't just write a letter and then sit home and wait. And just wait and wait, right? They're being active and proactive in their own lives. So it's hard, though, to tell by just looking at the letter, what were people really thinking, and how did people really feel when they were writing this? Were they rolling their eyes as they were writing all these flattering things about Saddam, or did some of them mean it? And I felt personally, and as a researcher and as an American, that I didn't ask people if they had ever written a letter to the Ba'ath Party. I just didn't know if that was an appropriate question to ask. But I did hear a story about one person who talked about it to another researcher friend of mine. And he's like, "Oh yeah, this woman, I met her. And she talked about, yeah, that it had something, if I remember correctly, something to do with like inheritance, right? Maybe a brother was trying to cheat her of part of her inheritance. So she wrote a letter to the government to step in, and she was willing to sort of talk about that. But it doesn't mean that was the only way she was trying to solve her problem."
Okay, so chapter 5. I think here where the deviant masculinity arised and where
Mhm.
policemen and people in the army were perceived as better people because they were protecting people, and they would do the same things that they prevented. So I remember a story where you shared in the book where a gypsy girl, or I don't know if she was considered a gypsy girl, but she was definitely thought of being a gypsy girl. And she was arrested by the police, but at the same time, the police in assaulted her sexually. So this like imbalance that Saddam created. Do you think that the Baath regime intentionally created that, or it was just how things went?
Hmm, that's a good question. I mean, I think unfortunately wherever there is power imbalances, and that can happen in any country between a police officer and a civilian. Like there's just a power imbalance between those two kinds of people that unfortunately some people take advantage of that to commit assault or sexual assault. And so it's hardly unique to the Ba'ath Party, but it's awful every time it happens. And certainly conditions in Iraqi prisons and we're terrible places for human rights violations systematically. So yes, like it was not just like, oh, one bad person, but like yes, part of the system that unfortunately that women I think were frequently assaulted if they were imprisoned or arrested. But yeah, so for me this chapter was a little bit different than the rest of the book in that I was looking a little bit more at kind of from the top down, like from the government, and a little bit less of kind of what I mean, it still is about survival, right, of ordinary people, but looking more at like crime and punishment and policing, a little bit more looking at kind of the government's actions there. But what I thought was interesting, so a lot of people um, have noted that sex work appeared to become more common in the 90s in Iraq because of survival and economic desperation and hunger. And so that piece, I wasn't, there were a few things that surprised me and I'll come back to that. But actually, what was after I spent more time researching, okay, how is the government thinking about gender and what does this have to do with policing? I kind of became convinced actually that in the 90s, the government was responding to what it perceived as a crisis of masculinity, that there was like a problem of like failed men, and that everything came from this. Like all of its responses to prostitution, all of its responses to men who didn't behave according to kind of traditional masculine norms. Like all of this was actually coming from their fear about the returning soldiers. And so, right, like, so after the Iran-Iraq War and then the Gulf War, there were hundreds of thousands of men who were being released from the army, but who had no jobs because of sanctions and the economy had collapsed. And so you have men that, yes, had been held up as war heroes, but who are now unemployed and not able to provide for their families. And then you have an increase in crime. The government's worried about an increase in drugs. There's a concern about an increase in prostitution, and all of these are sort of related to like people not getting married, settling down, and living like economically productive lives, right? And but it all kind of comes back to the man. Like if the man was married, maybe there wouldn't be as much sex work. If the man had a good job, maybe the women wouldn't be economically desperate. Like, and so what I saw was actually the government trying to use women to like solve the men's problems. So telling women you should get married early, telling women you shouldn't wear makeup, telling women you should dress more modestly, right? Telling women you should like bear more kids, like telling women you shouldn't be prostitutes, because all of this is about actually trying to restore the men to their position of honor. I don't know, that's at least kind of how I was reading it.
And one thing I think that is like what helped Saddam do that was like instilling the Arab masculine identity, and that we are masculine, and I don't accept that. Can you explain a bit about that, and how did that correlate to Iraqis?
Yeah, so it seems like, Saddam was different ideas of like what it meant to be a really Iraqi man had sort of varied over time. And so let's say in like the 50s or 60s or 70s, being a modern Iraqi man probably meant going to university, becoming a doctor, like becoming an engineer, right? Like having your family, living in a nice house. But then war comes and it becomes this military masculinity, right? Like a real man goes to war and is a war hero, right? And then returns home. And there's also, of course, like in any culture, in any society, there's like more traditional like values you can appeal to. And so in Iraq, he's also able to appeal to like older ideas of like what a real Arab man is. And some of this can come out of like a tribal context, but some of it's just appealing generally to like Arab masculinity and valor and kind of like the nomadic way of life or things like this. But so then, in the 90s, if you have a young man who is unemployed, who might be taking drugs. I actually don't think drugs were a big problem, but the government was like very worried about it. I'm sure it was a small percentage. But and like maybe growing his hair long and like listening to the Ramones or the Smiths or Nirvana. Like or like the government was like, "Oh my gosh, like this is so foreign. This is not what we want." And really began to talk a lot in cultural magazines, in talking newspapers and speeches about like what real men should do. And it's upholding this very kind of traditional view of like the man is the breadwinner and he should be married. And but so they kind of go after everyone that they view as like contributing to this. And so they're going after sex workers, especially women. They're also going after rural migrants and those who are part of the Ghajar community group, which is sometimes called, gypsies in English, um, who had their own kind of negative cultural stereotypes about drinking alcohol, about being part of, the sex trade, whether or not that's true, but like there were these stereotypes they were playing into. And then going after men who didn't seem to conform to traditional ways of dressing or acting. And men's sexuality was also then scrutinized for that too.
Yeah, definitely. Um, One aspect that I saw, I mean, I see in this day in an age, like I lived through that, is that everyone in the military or like in the police, anything in the army or anything, they always act in this arrogant manner. It's like people are always less than them and they demand their respect, and like in a very unpleasant way, I can say. Um how do you think but do you think that's true? Like, do you think that came from that point of history?
That's interesting. I mean, I think there's just something about the power imbalance of being a man in a uniform with a gun that tempts a lot of men in every country to feel a sense of power and pride and sometimes abuse that. But I do think that from the Iran-Iraq War and the Gulf War, I mean, we talked about all the propaganda, we talked about all the parades. There was so much work that the government did to. But I mean, I think if we go back and think about our discussion in chapter 2 and just remember how much work the government spent with the propaganda and the parades and, all this kind of cultural production about what it means to be in the military, it shapes the culture. I mean, Iraq had not been part of a major war for generations. World War One and World War Two didn't have a huge impact on Iraq. The British invasion, of course, it had all sorts of political effects, but like the actual fighting part of the war was relatively light, I guess, in the scheme of things. So it wasn't like Iraq had this long-standing tradition of an army with 1 million people before. This was coming new, and so I do think that that does shape the military culture going forward. I just imagine it would have to. Um, and I guess we can also say, like, even more recently, though, since 2003, men with guns have had a big influence and have been very powerful. And so it continues, just it manifests itself in different ways and for different reasons.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, and it also like plays a role of like the how patriarchy is perceived and everything, um, and controlling women. It's very interesting. Um, I can't help but like shift to chapter 6, which is the downfall of Saddam's regime and the invasion of the U.S. While I want to go into the effects that the US and President Bremer had on the local society, because now we're having a huge shift in dynamics, because Iraqis are so, even though suffered a lot from Saddam's regime, they had their life systemized in a way that it's not easy just to let go all of a sudden. And I think the biggest mistake you mentioned actually in your book, I don't think that I read that in your book, is that you you said that the US had not took into consideration the systems that were there, the council system that is very prominent in Arab societies as a whole, into consideration. They did not take that into consideration, and it led to people feeling not provided for. So one notion that was interesting to me before you get into total, and I would appreciate if you get into it chronologically, because I might get this question might be at like in the middle of the chapter. But one interesting notion is that the U.S. Army was surprised when people were asking for personal problems to be solved, because that's what they're used to, and they just had the councils for the needs of the people in general. You know, the whether it's construction or anything they need for their housing on it or anything. So what are your notes on that, starting from the U.S. invasion and the downfall of Saddam?
Yeah, so the US invasion in Iraq is a topic that has been so interesting for me to discuss with Iraqis because my own positionality as an American is just unavoidably present in these conversations. And so I often am actually not sure that I can always tell what the Iraqi I'm talking to really thinks, because I think people are often being polite with me. So that's just as a caveat and a preface, because I'm going to be really interested to hear some of your responses to this chapter as well. But so when the US invades, um, they have not done really any research about conditions inside the country. And there's lots of reasons for that. Partly, they are relying on people like Ahmed Chalabi and other parts of the Iraq National Congress who are based outside the Iraq to tell them what it's like. And they're only hearing maybe kind of part of the story. But I just also am not sure that the people who were planning the war were very interested in doing the research. But sometimes when I say that, people say, "Oh, so if America had been more prepared, would it have gone better?" And I never want to make it sound like an invasion of another country is going to like be better. Like I don't want to be like, "Oh yeah, then," because like it's an invasion that was not authorized by the UN. Like, so I don't ever want to make it sound like, oh, like there could have been a good version of this invasion versus this bad version of the invasion. And that's not what I'm trying to communicate. But I do think the Americans created a lot of extra suffering and extra confusion by not knowing much about Iraq. not about its people, not about the system of governance that they were replacing, all sorts of things. And so, okay, so that's one point. Another point I want to make is that the Iraqi people had, like you said, many of them had suffered under Saddam. Many did not like Saddam or support Saddam, but they had nevertheless kind of figured out how to live under Saddam, for better or worse, right? They had like developed their survival strategies. And they had gotten used to interacting with the state bureaucracy and with the Baath Party bureaucracy. And then when the US invades, like almost instantly, like overnight, that is gone. Like just gone, all of it. The state is gone, the ministries are gone, the municipality is gone. Some of that comes back a little bit, but just like the immediate invasion, like everyone stays home and the Baath Party is done. And then, the government does the de-Baathification policy that, fires a lot of government workers, even if they weren't particularly committed Baathists. They just, they were university professors and had to, or whatever, right? So, okay. So for the Iraqi people, how are they going to navigate this new force, this new government, or, this new occupation that's completely unlike the systems that they used before? And so I think that's where some of the extra unnecessary kind of suffering and confusion came in, because the US didn't even know what it was replacing, didn't know kind of how the Baath Party bureaucracy had been organized, how services had been distributed. And some of that was that I think the American government was naive, and they thought that they would simply replace Saddam and his ruling circle, but that the state would remain and these ministries would remain and the municipality would remain, and the US would just become like the new one giving orders, that the police would remain. But it doesn't remain, and then they have to recreate it because they didn't plan ahead for that possibility. So what I was interested in this chapter was just saying, okay, there's a total power vacuum. There's a complete collapse in essential services, especially like in that first year. One of the most common things that Iraqis remember is that they didn't have cooking fuel. Like no one could get cooking fuel or fuel for their houses or fuel for their cars. I mean, just like fuel was really hard to come by. And then, of course, other things like food and medicine, electricity. I mean, the US invades in spring, so summer happens very quickly. Very few people had private personal generators yet. Like now that's extremely common, but that wasn't something a lot of people had. So the heat that summer was really intense. I mean, but like there's no one to fix these problems because there's no government and there's no infrastructure for that anymore. And so I wanted to know, like, how are people surviving? What are the Americans trying? And then what are some other actors that come up that try to fill this gap?
Yeah, interesting. So, one of the notably, let's say, things that the US did is the CPA, Coalition Provisional Authority. What kind of consequences do you think they had on Iraqi society till this day?
Oh, I mean, I think the whole political system was developed in that first 2 years, the first year and a half. And it's Bremer, the ambassador Bremer, who was in charge of the CPA and was basically the ruler of Iraq for that first year or so. It's also the governing council that was made up of a lot of these exiled Iraqis who came back, so people like Chalabi. And in combination, like Bremer and the CPA, and then this small group of Iraqi exiles are creating the system that we have today, like that we call the Muhassasa Ta'ifiyya or El Muhassasa El Hizbiyya system, where power and resources gets divided into these political parties that have sectarian affiliations. And it has created so much pain and hardship. It is really tough to see because I think there was an opportunity. I think there was a desire by Iraqis and Americans to try to have a government that was free and fair and better than what came before it. And of course, it's, better in ways, and freedom of speech, I think, is actually a really one clear like outcome that comes from it. Like, there is a lot of Iraqi newspapers now, and like there's like freedom of speech is something that is a result, but it hasn't been a very functional system that provides essential services for the needs of the people by and large. And the Tisserine protests, I know we're part of this, but it's been a complaint for a long time. The corruption really came from this period. I mean, I think a lot of Iraq's problems today you can trace back to 2003. And yes, there are some deeper origins in the Saddam era. It's like especially corruption became a bigger issue in Iraq in the 90s, but not on the scale that it became after 2003. And so I'm sorry to say that I do think a lot of Iraq's political problems today do stem from the US invasion.
Yeah, and I think that it's mostly about creating this ethno-sectarian
Mhm.
and entrenching, like it's creating sectarian identity as a form of political currency. This is, I think, was the most effect that it had on Iraq, which is proceeding to be the same till this day, right? But I also believe that the reason, like after reading your book, is that it's not just this reason, but it's became like whoever is the service provider is the ruler, and that at the time was a Sadr. So he was providing mostly. He had the Mahdi army. He was like protecting. So since Iraqis are very used to having the Baath structure and like having people provide for them, having the government, I mean, provide for them, it only made sense to rely on the next provider, right? And maybe it would help if you share more about that era where like Sadr was like struggling with the councils and like trying to build his name up and trying to provide for people, and why particularly the Sadr has arose to power, you think?
Yeah. I think it's so fascinating. So, I guess I'll start the story with with Sauder's side of it, and then I'll come back and I can explain more about the American councils. But so, I mean, so I was let's see, I was in high school and college when the US invaded Iraq. So I followed it very, very closely, and I watched all the headlines. And then, of course, later I went back and really studied this myself as a researcher. And there were a lot of things I knew about the US invasion. I knew about the looting, I knew about the corruption. But I think until I really started talking to Iraqis, I didn't understand the impact of like, the day that the Americans came, the garbage stopped being collected. Like, like the just basic essential services that we take for granted in any major city in the world, just that keeps life sustained, stopped because that was the government that provided that. And there was no government anymore. And it eventually, right, people would kind of recreate this. Okay, but so just the kind of suffering that happens when you're like, there's a sewage pipe broken and it's spilling out into the street, and there's actually no one to call. Like, there's no one who exists that I can call to fix this unless we fix it ourselves. The neighbors fix it themselves. And so Sauder, who was sort of a rising figure at the time. This was really the time when he became famous and well known. What's interesting is that he didn't just create a militia, which is, I think, the more famous part of his work is the Mahdi army, but he created also the Sauder Bureau and this office that was just providing social services, humanitarian services. And actually, so I think on the one hand, he's an Iraqi, he sees the need and he knows what people are used to. Also, there are previous examples like Hezbollah in Lebanon or even Hamas in Gaza. They have a similar, or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They had similar strategies of combining their political message with social services. So he's also not totally creating this out of, like, he's not inventing this for the first time either. So I don't know if he's thinking about that consciously, that, oh, this is sort of like Hezbollah, but he certainly might be well influenced by an organization like that as well. But so in the neighborhoods he controls, which is, especially Sadr City, he is able to provide fuel. He is able to provide medicine. He is able to provide food and employment, right? Because you can get a job in his militia, or you could get a job in his bureau. And so he is providing security, right? He's providing checkpoints. And so functionally, he becomes the government. He is the state for that neighborhood, at least for that district. And people, myself and other researchers did surveys and talked to people in different parts of the city. And people in Sadr City talked about the years from like 2003 to 2008 that way. Like Sadr was the state. There was no state. It was only Sadr, whether you liked him or not. Like, and not everyone supported him because it came at a huge cost. And of course, like, why did he have resources? Well, of course, it was also because of the violence that was taking place at that time. But there was a direct benefit to people who received those services, and no one else in the rest of Baghdad had services like that. There was no one else who was able to achieve that same thing. And he had it partly, I think, because he had more financial resources to draw on. He had more organizational strategy. I mean, I just don't think there were a lot of other organizations that had the infrastructure. But so then you have the Americans, on the other hand, who are very slow to even respond to security issues, garbage. Like, that could have been different. That was a choice. There was a reluctance to actually take ownership of the problems that they were creating and realize the Americans had to take on some government functions in Iraq because they had destroyed what came before. I think there was initially in the first few months kind of trying to say, oh no, the US troops, we're going to leave soon. We're just going to hand this over and leave, and not really wanting to create or help rebuild like the municipal services. But so what the Americans were doing is they were like creating neighborhood councils. Well, like, all people had at this point with the collapse of the state was their neighborhood, right? You just have your neighbors. Like, people are like literally just banding together because there's no larger organizational structure. And so you have like neighborhood protection groups to try to keep bad actors out. You have neighbors helping each other with food, neighbors like repairing things. Sometimes the mosque is helping organize it. Sometimes it's just the people on their own. People are just trying to survive. So then the Americans come in and say, well, let's create neighborhood councils. And when Iraqis hear about these councils, I think for a lot of folks, they assumed it would be like their mukhtar. It would be like the furqa. It would be like the neighborhood forms of governance that the Baath had in the old system, who were actually powerful decision makers, who had resources, who had the power of like the police behind them or the military behind them, like, who were really effective. They could be brutal, but they could be effective. And so people could go to them with their problems, and those problems could get solved. But the Americans have no idea that that's what Iraqis expect. No clue, because they just don't know. They just haven't even asked. They haven't found out. And Americans are thinking of American civic councils. They're thinking about their own cultural context and trying to recreate American practices in Iraq that just don't meet the needs of the Iraqi people. So they want these councils to provide, like, build playgrounds, have women's sewing circles, help provide uniforms to school kids. Lovely things, but not what people were asking for in that moment. And so people would come to the council and say, I need childcare. I need money. I need medicine. And they're like, we're not here to solve your problem. Like, that's your problem. That's a personal problem. Like, we're here just to, receive input. And they also, these councils, the American councils, had no money, had no budgets, had no decision-making power. They were just supposed to kind of collect citizen input and then relay it maybe to the municipality as the municipality is kind of getting, reorganized. So Iraqis very quickly sort of gave up on them, just like this isn't very effective. But in Sadr City, Sadr saw it as a rival. Even if they weren't that effective, he's like, no, I'm providing services. I'm the problem solver. Like, I don't want anyone else trying to do the same thing. And so the district council in Sadr City, created by the Americans, ended up clashing with the Sadrists many times because Sadr wanted to make sure that he had a monopoly.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. Um, I mean, there was like a lot of elements that shaped politics today in Baghdad, and you asked about what I think personally, and I honestly don't feel that I should have an opinion about this because I am not like a I'm not good in politics and I don't know much of politics because I am the history because I'm young. But the narrative, I can tell you about the narratives I hear, and the narrative I hear about the whole thing, the U.S. invasion and everything, is that the U.S. actually, and it's a conspiracy theory, I have to say, but it's believed by a lot of Iraqis, and I'm not gonna say all of them, but like most Iraqis, is that the Americans deliberately brought the militia or like the militia system in order to weaken society, and this like ethno-sectarian kind of politics is deliberately brought in order to weaken Iraq, in order to take the oil and everything, the usual narrative. But I think it's also turning into a question for you, is that do you think that was true, that it was deliberately made to ruin the social fabric of Iraq, or it was the consequence of their neglect?
It's a good question, and it's such a heartbreaking question. Relatedly, I am familiar with again sort of that conspiracy theory of like why the looting happened, right? And that the US wanted looting to happen to destroy the country, to weaken the country. And then, why is it, how is it that such a powerful country couldn't fix the electrical grid, it couldn't provide, basic services like what you're telling me, like the Americans don't know how to do that, and I understand like there's sort of like a painful truth to those questions. On the one hand, clearly it was not a priority. If it had been a priority, I think the plans and the planning for how the US went into the country and how it acted, especially in the first year, would have been different had they valued and prioritized preserving Mesopotamian heritage. They would have protected the museum. Had they valued and prioritize the idea of even something like more self-interested, like wanting Iraq to be a trade partner right away. Well, they wouldn't have allowed just the electrical grid and the infrastructure to be so damaged, right? That caused billions of dollars in damage from looting and then later from other kinds of attacks. Like there would have been greater effort, right? So you have to, I mean, I think there has to be a conclusion there that it wasn't part of their original plan, and that says something, it reflects something. There has been, I think historians are trying to look back and figure out, with the benefit of hindsight, why and how the government structure, the ethnic sectarian government structure, came to be. And the first version of the narrative was that the Americans came in, they misunderstood Iraqi society, they thought it was more sectarian than it was, and so they thought that they were helping preserve Kurdish and Shiite rights and correcting historic injustices, and that by creating the system, they thought that they were helping. Now, one only has to look at Lebanese history to know that there's a living example of what happens when you create a political system based on confessional identity. So there are people in the US State Department who focus on Lebanon. Like, there are people who know that, weren't being listened to. But the current thinking and some newer research is placing more responsibility on the Iraqi National Congress, the INC, and Chalabi's group. That Chalabi's group wanted this system because they thought it benefited them and this small group. So I think that's the interesting thing about history, is that sometimes as time goes by, our perspective on the past changes. Sometimes as time goes by, we get new evidence, we get new, my colleague Wissam Shabi has done a lot of interviews with the Americans, and a lot of people were willing to talk to him now that it's been 20 years. And so he's part of the group that's offering some new evidence and some new interpretations. So maybe we'll get more clarity as time goes by. But I think no matter what, whether it was the Americans or the INC or even new actors, local in Iraq, who then led new political parties and so forth, a small group of people benefit from the system. And once those people were in influential power and it was created, there's a lot of interest in keeping it because some people are getting really rich. But most people are not benefiting from the system. And I will be hopeful that someday Iraq will have a healthy, functioning government that its people very much deserve. But I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and it's sure is a hope. I think my last question about this topic is that what was the priority then? You mentioned that it wasn't the U.S. priority to prioritize those things, and obviously, like, I'm no expert in politics or anything, but when you're invading a country, like you don't have the people's need in priority, right? But like, what was the priority for the U.S. when the invasion happened?
Yeah. So a lot of people talk about oil, but I think there were actually other factors that were at least as influential. And also, if the Americans were really after oil, they didn't do a very good job of taking it. Does that make sense? Like, in the end, it wasn't like the US set up all of these American-owned companies to just extract it for themselves. So I think, to me, that's another indication that there were also other interests and factors. And again, I will say this as someone who, I defer to the political scientists on a lot of this as well. But for me, my understanding is that there was actually a lot of ideological motivation that was shaping how the George W. Bush administration approached Iraq. And I also think that when you're understanding how the US approached Iraq, you have to start in 1990. And you can't just start in 2003 or with 9/11 in 2001. And again, there's been some really good research on this, but basically, since the Gulf War, the US was trying to overthrow Saddam. I mean, so, it's like, it was not a new idea, and it was under, 3 different presidents. It was George Bush the father, then under Bill Clinton, then under George W. Bush the son. All of them were trying to get rid of Saddam. And it was through the Gulf War, then it was through sanctions, then Clinton bombed Iraq in 1998, and there were other bombings. And then, yes, 9/11, the attacks in 2001 provided the new excuse. And it was an excuse because there's been no evidence that has linked Saddam to Osama bin Laden in any meaningful way, substantive way. They may have kind of known of each other. People have looked into that, but it wasn't like they were actively in partnership. But so what were they after? What were they trying to do? Well, one was just the US had decided for a long time that Saddam was against their interests and they wanted to remove him. So that's one. But then the George W. Bush's government was very influenced by what's called like neocon political ideology. And they thought if every country practiced free trade and if every country was a democracy, and even if you forced them, like by invading them and toppling them, and you forced them to develop democracy, then basically every country in the world will become friendly to America. And this is part of what guided the invasion of Afghanistan. It's part of what guided the invasion of Iraq. It's part of what caused George W. Bush to open friendly diplomatic relations with Gaddafi in Libya. And it's also part of the US supporting the elections in the Palestinian territories in 2006. They were like, more democracy. And I think in every case, it didn't work out the way, I mean, I just think it was sort of a failed theory. But unfortunately, they were willing to test it on real people and real people who suffered and real people who died and lost their homes. And I think there was a lot of arrogance in thinking they could just reshape the world how they wanted.
That's very, very interesting and sad. I think this book, although I really don't want it to end, but it ends in something beautiful yet very sad, and it's the Tishreen protesters, and wow, I don't know how I feel about this because I was a Tishreen protester myself. I had paintings on the walls and everything, but a part of me really understood what I was asking for as well through your book. And you mentioned about like this book was basically focusing on Baghdad neighborhoods and like how it shaped identity along history, not just with the Saddam era or any government. It was very, very long ago, dating back to the Ottoman Empire. So one beautiful thing that actually, let me get the book and read it for you. So one of the most beautiful sentences that I actually, when I reached the end of the book, I had goosebumps. It was so beautiful. So you mentioned, crucially, protesters represented a diverse array of Baghdad population with different socio-economic and sectarian backgrounds. In this liminal space created by the protesters did not only proclaim their right to the city and demand the services and justice owed to them as citizens, they also symbolically recreated a space in Baghdad's center that transcended boundaries of class, age, profession, and gender, which is something that really rules Baghdad this day. And I think that's very beautifully said as well. So that brings me to the question, how do you think the Tishreen protesters shaped Baghdad today as it's growing?
So I think we are still waiting to see the full impact of Tishreen. I think what the Tishreen protesters did over many months with their own bodies, right? Like putting their bodies at risk, creating this community in, the middle of the city, is that they made sure it was unmistakable that no one would ever forget that the young people of Iraq demanded better. They demanded something better than what the legacies of governance have created for them. They deserve better than this ethno-sectarian system in 2003. They deserve an opportunity to heal better from what happened under the Saddam era. They just deserve the freedoms and rights to live and live well and to flourish in safety and in like mutual regard, one for another. And that the elders in the generation and then this occupying force of the Americans from the outside have not allowed this to happen, have prevented this from happening, but that they want it to happen. And I think it's so powerful. It is incredibly powerful what was demanded, how it was demanded, how long the protesters persisted for. And so many people died. so many people died. I think there's like beautiful heroic photos. I love there's this one photo I've seen of just like a that's taken up from the Turkish restaurant. So you just see all of the protesters in the street and it's so moving, but in some ways then you forget the darker moments of the protest and how many people were hurt and how many people were killed. The problem is, of course, that we've seen the backlash happen, right? And so we saw that the political classes are so invested in keeping the system going that even the concessions that were offered, like a new election law, a new prime minister, in the end weren't lasting changes. And now we see, this big swing back. There's no interest in telling the story of the Tishreen protesters, having a monument. Even I've been hearing that it's been more and more risky to even just really even talk about it. That the mood has really changed and become more chilling. And that's where I said, I don't think we can see the end of the story yet.
That is very beautiful and very moving, Alissa. I think one last part in the book where you talk about how the Tishreen protesters has shaped the construction of Baghdad, because as you know, Baghdad has been like blooming with malls and restaurants and being this like vibrant city on the cost of the greenery of Baghdad, which is very, very sad. And other people, other parts of the population suffer the consequences. And there is one part where you mentioned that it is not particularly a good thing because this malls and everything are owned by also sectarian people in power, so there's also a power dynamic, and it's not particularly something that is good. What are your notes on that? And perhaps I'll be ending with a question: where do you see Baghdad going from this point? As it's going from construction and everything, what does the future hold?
My colleague Omar Siri has done really wonderful work on tracing where the money is coming from for some of these projects, right? For some of these shopping malls and restaurants, and kind of doing really convincing work to demonstrate that, yeah, a lot of construction and development, like behind the scenes, is often like militias or political parties, and unfortunately there's just a lot of corruption, and that even people from other countries are sometimes using construction inside of Iraq for money laundering, right, and to hide their money that way. So there's this sort of dark side to looking at some of the otherwise kind of outwardly exciting signs of Iraq's redevelopment, especially like in the post-ISIS years, we could say. But I don't know. On the other hand, I also don't kind of want to fully take that away. Like when I have spent time with friends in Baghdad, and we drive around and we see the movie theaters and we see the cool cafes, and I even had a chance to go to the Alf Layla wa Layla palaces that have been like designed into these beautiful restaurants. Like, I don't know, there is something life-giving too about that. And so many of the Baghdadis I talk to are just like proud to see their city rebuilding and having fun. And it's not just about car bombings, right? And it's like, let us build something and enjoy it. And even so, okay, it's coming from some dirty money, but it is also making the city beautiful again in this way. Or not everyone thinks it's beautiful, I should say. Some people don't don't like the impact of some of this development on the aesthetic of the city, I suppose. But so I don't want to like just be negative about it, because there is something wonderful about being out late at night in Baghdad, enjoying a really great meal, feeling safe, that I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, like it would have been almost impossible to imagine the city acting like that again in a carefree way. And I know it's not all carefree. I know there's sort of undercurrents of tricky things in the city still, but how far it's come from some of its worst moments in these recent years. So this is historians only feel comfortable talking about the past. I get uncomfortable when I'm asked about the future. I'm like that's, but I think I think it's been exciting to see the arts scene, the literature scene, the nightlife in Baghdad, and I hope for Baghdad that it gets to continue um, spaces in which people feel that they are thriving.
You mentioned about the board game cafe. There's a lot of them today, and they're just it's just like it's blooming with restaurant. There's a insider joke that Baghdad should all be caged into one big restaurant because it's basically just restaurants right now, you know? Yeah, so it's very interesting. Maybe we're ending on a bad note. I don't want it to be, but I have like curiosity to this question, which is like, um, what kind of like consequences do you think that this blooming is going to have, you know, on Iraq? Because as you said, there's like it's obviously dirty money and like people in power owning those places. So what kind of consequences, if it has any consequences, do you think it has?
It's a good question. I mean, I think long term, the Iraqi economy is suffering and will continue to suffer from this. I mean, already, I mean, so much money, so much wealth produced by oil that belongs to the Iraqi people has been stolen, has been embezzled, has been wasted, has been, right? And so the country, I mean, I always tell people, I'm like, the Iraq should look like Dubai. Like it should look like Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. Like, and I always contextualize that in terms of like, of course, war and sanctions, like there's a reason it doesn't, and it has to do with history. Um, but like Iraq has the fourth largest oil reserves in the world, fourth or fifth. The electricity shouldn't cut out 5 times a day. And it's in Baghdad, in the capital, it shouldn't be cutting out. Like you, the country, Iraqis deserve so much better. And it's corruption that like explains in my mind like 90% or more of like why these problems persist. So even with all the new restaurants and the malls, if the money isn't being like reinvested properly into the economy, it's only going to like be something that a very small group of people are benefiting from and that a relatively small percentage of Iraqis can even then enjoy. Like who can go to these restaurants? Who can go to these malls? If we're not actually creating robust employment throughout the economy. And I've heard like terrible stories of like Iraqis needing to pay really expensive bribes to get just their job, like for college graduates to get a job. And so that's holding everyone back and it's holding the economy back. And so if corruption doesn't get fixed, the whole country will just continue to suffer from that, unfortunately, is based on just seeing the impact of corruption in other countries, say like Eastern European countries, like it hurts the people.
Yeah. Um, in your final conclusion, you talked about how the design of Baghdad and what happened to it has shaped the rhythms of time and everything, and the spaces and the memories that people have with the spaces. And it will always be a story of trauma for the older generation and maybe a different one for the younger generation. But um, you mentioned that in your work, you hope that people don't see Baghdad as the sectarian kind of place that it is because the Shia people who are living in Kadmia are different from the Shia people who are living in the Sadr city. So it's not really about sectarianism. It's about what happened to the people and the places and the memories. I guess with that, I'm trying to ask, what is your message from this work? What is your message from this book?
Oh, it's a big question. It's a good question. I think there's a few messages I'm hoping come through from this book. And the first is the resilience of Iraqis and the Iraqi people. I'm hoping that some of the stories that I had the privilege and pleasure to get to read through the archives or hear through my interviews, I hope that some of those stories now reach a broader audience, or like yourself, like reach Iraqis but in a new way, or a new generation that maybe hasn't heard all of these or hasn't lived all of these. That's my biggest hope for this book. Um, and then I think beyond that, I do hope to shift our focus away from these identity categories, like you said, like, well, not all Shia are the same. There's ones in Qadimiyya, there's ones in Sadr City, like there's ones in Sharla, there's ones in the south. There's like which Shia, like, and to think more about the kinds of local stories and experiences that communities have and create and remember and hold and build into their environment. And so I think that's where I think I'm probably at risk of like overly romanticizing neighborhoods. But I do think, like I was in Karada, and Karada, is one of these old neighborhoods and sort of these like old families, uh, and parts of Karada actually weren't displaced nearly as much as some other neighborhoods in the city were in the early 2000s. And so I was there and kind of walking through the streets in Karada and talking with some of the people I had met there. And there was just such a palpable sense of like, this is our home. Like Baghdad's our home, but really it's Karada is our home. And we know the families and we know the landmarks and we know the churches, we know our neighbors, we know, like, we have lived this together for generations. And this is who we are. And I think you can tell that story about so many different districts in Baghdad. Like Qadimiyya, I think, is another great example that's just had its own unique history, its own unique place, like its own unique relationship to the rest of the city. And it's as the host of the shrines and the shrine, visitors who come there. Or thinking then too about like the experiences of Sadr City, both the persecution they had, but also then like the services they received. Like everyone has a different story to tell based on their location, based on their home, based on their community, who they lived with. And I think it's an invitation to help us think about the smaller stories, the more local stories that actually shape our worldview and shape our perspective, shape our own sense of ourselves, much more deeply than I think the categories that politicians use. And I think about this even in my own like American context. I started my early interest in history was by learning about Chicago neighborhoods. I grew up near Chicago. Each neighborhood has a totally distinct identity and history, and people identify by their neighborhoods. And I was like, oh, so you can't just think Democrat, Republican, man, woman, rich, poor. You're like, no, it's like, well, what was your experience in this like Polish neighborhood in this place in this time? It's smaller stories that actually reveal more of our humanity. I think maybe I summed it up there, so maybe I'll
Yeah,
leave it
that's so beautiful, Alyssa. Again, I am so grateful for your work, and I don't know how to express this enough in perhaps English words, but I don't know. For me, like you've been the mother of knowledge about my city and my own history, and just like I've told you, like I couldn't stop talking about this book with my friends and sharing it, and now I have a list of people that are waiting to read this book after me, like I have to share it around. It's very touching and very well researched, and I really do appreciate it so much, for lack of better words. I saw that in parts of your book where in the end you mentioned that there is a lot of research to be done, and there could be a research about how that relation took on to other parts of Iraq, because you mainly focused on Baghdad. And if you ever work on that, I would be really excited to read it, you know. Do you have any plans of actually writing more books or doing more research about Iraq?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually think that for my next project, I would be really interested to compare like cities and neighborhoods, but between different places. So like I am really curious to compare between the neighborhoods and the governance of neighborhoods in Baghdad with neighborhoods in Beirut in particular, because I think some of
Cool.
the sectarian differences, the confessional differences, the civil war, like there's certain parallels, but I also know there will be a lot of differences too. And I think the comparison could be really interesting. And so what I'm hoping is actually is to collaborate and work with other scholars, you know, kind of combine our insights. People talk about this with like Damascus as well. And of course, the Syria Baath party, like that's another kind of interesting point of comparison, like two different um, Baath party capitals. What is that like? So I kind of want to keep going with neighborhoods and see what insights can be gained a little more broadly. And then we'll see what happens. But I
Beautiful.
love the Iraqi people so much. I love Baghdad so much that I hope I won't be away for too long.
Very cool. I was just gonna ask about that. Like, I would really love to see you again in Baghdad. So let me know if you're ever here. Um, Thank you so much, Alyssa. Like, I really appreciate the interview. Thank you for sitting through the technical problems, but mostly thank you for the book. And I don't have enough words for to appreciate this book, to be honest. Thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, well, Sarah, thank you so much. I mean, like I said, I wouldn't care if anyone read this book, except that I care that Iraqis read this book. Just like it meant the world to me. And you read this book more carefully than anyone. I feel like you like had memorized the book and you understood it so well. I was like, oh, you're summarizing this, but you're basically saying anything I would have said already. And so that, you know, I feel like to show love to a scholar is to show love for our scholarship. And I was like, oh, like you really I can see all the care that you brought in preparing for this interview and reading this book and sharing it with others. And that means the world to me.
I really appreciate it. I really didn't prepare much when it comes to the book, because I was genuinely interested, and even the notes that I had, like everything was in the back of my mind already, you know, maybe because it relates to me so much, but I really enjoyed